Unrecycled. I'm Dr. David Johnson, Professor of Medicine and Chief of Gastroenterology at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, plastics are a day-to-day part of our life, right? We use them all the time. We have a plastic water bottle in our hand. When we travel, we cook with plastics. We have our groceries wrapped in plastics or food heated up in plastics. And virtually there's been an incredible growth of plastic production over the last 7 decades. Back to the 1950s, it's estimated that nearly 9 billion tons of plastic have been produced. And we think we do well when we try and recycle these. Well, that sounds good, but it's estimated that only about 11% of stuff gets recycled, so not so good there. And what happens to it? What gets dumped in unregulated sites of land, sometimes into water, sometimes it gets burned, it gets aerosolized. And progressively, because of this degradation or burning and upregulation as it goes into the air, it becomes a composite of the air, the water, the soil, and as such progressively becomes infiltrated and becomes part of the normal ingestion or growth patterns of virtually the entire life cycle of everything that's alive. So it is increasingly aware that we're seeing more and more exposure to this. In fact, the estimates are that the average American ingests currently the equivalent of 5.5 grams of plastic per week. That's like eating a credit card once a week. Well, how do you get it? Well, you can breathe it and it comes in through aerosolization. You can ingest it. And again, it's not much from dermatologic exposure. But these products are not just the things that we see, but they're also related to the things that potentially we use for medications, a variety of textiles, chemical weathering changes the dynamics of how these things are transferred in the environment. But we see these are routinely used, microbeads that are used in medicines, in cosmetics, personal care products, abrasives. It's in your printer as it relates to 3D printing powder. So these plastics are categorized as microplastics when they're less than 5 millimeters in size. That's something we can generally think you can see. And nanoplastics when they're less than 1 micrometer in size, and that's something you obviously can't see. Histologically, you may not even see these things, so it requires spectroscopy or some type of fluorescent micrologic analysis that allows these things to be detected. So you won't be seeing these standardly on your routine path report. So let's fast forward. What happens when you ingest or have these things in your tract of entry, be it the GI or the pulmonary? These are inflammatory, and it's now multiple studies have shown, animal studies in a variety of nematodes and even some fish models have shown that it has a dramatic effect on gut dysbiosis, and particularly in the humans, that decreases Bacteroides phylum, which is the anti-inflammatory phylum, and which we see decreased inflammatory bowel disease. And I'll come back to that in a bit, but nonetheless, it just increases dysbiosis, decreases diversity. So again, setting up an imbalance in your GI tract. Well, it also seems to have a dramatic effect. Again, animal studies have been very consistent on this, is it changes gut integrity, and the intestinal layer, intestinal barriers are reduced. It downregulates tight junction proteins like claudin or zonulin or occludin, and this allows translocation of the bacteria or the plastics itself, or the metabolites of the whatever the microbiome, not just through the intestinal wall, but virtually it's evident throughout every organ in your body. And this has now been shown by numerous studies that show that these plastic nanoparticles can be anywhere in the body, including the brain. So as these products are disruptive, inflammatory cytokines that are upregulated include things like TNF-alpha, interleukin 6, and in particular some of the inflammatory cytokines that change gut integrity, but they also change blood barrier integrity. So these particles again emerge into the brain as well. Well, what does this all mean? Well, these inflammatory cytokines are not necessarily invoking, or the plastics are not invoking a cell death, but they certainly are changing cell structure and cell function. In multiple studies, both on a cellular analysis and as well as in vivo studies, have shown this repeatedly. So they are very biologically active, none of which have anything that are good associated. Let's get to some of the disease states. One that really caught my eye recently was a study in the New England Journal. We'll get to GI in a second, but this was striking because it was published looking at 304 patients that had a carotid endarterectomy. Then they looked at the plaques from the endarterectomy, and they had approximately 150 of these people had these nanoparticles, the nanoplastics, identified in the plaques, and as opposed to those that did not have those, it was 58% had the nanoparticles. Compared to those that didn't, the hazard ratio of them having a associated cardiac event, stroke, or death of any cause was approximately 4.5 times greater. So again, now looking at not randomized controlled trials, but longitudinal studies or analog studies suggesting a proof of pilot analysis suggesting that there is a disease associated with this. How about GI diseases? Well, we said it changes gut integrity and it upregulates a variety of the cytokines. Well, it makes sense, again, with the decrease in the diversity and the decrease in the Bacteroides phylum, it would make sense that it relates to inflammatory bowel disease. And there are some longitudinal studies now that beyond animal studies that have actually shown some increased likelihood of these nanoparticles being identified in patients with inflammatory bowel disease. A very recent study also in an animal model with the ingestion of the nanoplastics was able to produce a Crohn's-like illness in a mouse study, but again, something that was provoked as opposed to the control population that didn't have the nanoparticles. It relates to liver disease. There is a very strong association, at least experimentally, as it relates in animals, as it relates to development of the sciatic liver disease, or MAFLD, the non-fatty liver, if you will, but the metabolic associated steatosis liver disease. And these are things now that have animal data, and there's increasing data. In a very recent review, looked at the methodologic reasons why this makes sense. These get transported through the nanoparticles, transported to the portal vein, and induce all these cytokine upregulations in the liver. There was also data, at least on a comparative cohort analysis in a retrospective study looking at liver biopsies and cirrhotics, and the significant nanoparticle deposition in cirrhosis was evident, as opposed to none of the patients that had healthy liver as their liver biopsies were analyzed. So what do we have? Well, we've got an epidemiologic potential nightmare. The environmental risk is explosive and continues at incremental rates. It's estimated by 2050 that the annual production of plastics will exceed 1.1 billion tons per year. What is being done about this? Well, there are some directives. The European Union passed a chemical legislation measure in 2023 to actually block or restrict microplastics being added to products. And we said these are related to virtually everything we see in medications and cosmetics and stuff. At least in Europe, that is now a project that was initiated in late 2023. And even the United Nations Environmental Assembly approved an agreement in 2024 that looked at ways to potentially make policies and enforcing them as it relates to exposures to humans, in particular as it relates to some of the exposures to these nanoplastics and microplastics. What can we do? Well, I think certainly bringing this to the awareness of clinicians is one, but for your patients as well. Mitigation strategies may include things like reducing your exposure to plastic in consumptive ways, your water bottles, reusing things for cooking, management practices, improving these as how these are processed and how these are ultimately dealt with as they're dumped back into the environment, and looking at ways that we can limit these potentially in consumer products, and potentially also looking at ways that can be developed in biodegradable alternatives. So microplastics, nanoplastics, the evidence, we need longitudinal scientific studies to really corroborate this even further. But I think the scientific evidence thus far has some striking implications. I believe it's real. How far we go with this and the implications yet to be defined. But alert, alert, alert. I think nanoplastics are something that we need to consider, in particular in gastroenterologic, as well as virtually all other disease states. The evidence yet to be determined, but is very alarming at this point. Please consider this as you talk with your patients and your own personal health. I'm Dr. David Johnson. Thanks again for listening.